Well, the premise of Young Rock is we take a look and we examine my earlier years when I was a little boy, my earlier years when I was a teenager, early teenage years, and then my later teenage years as I got to the University of Miami. And, like in life, we all have these ups and downs, and I've had my fair share of them. And the idea of $7 and the spirit of $7 is laced throughout the show. And the spirit of $7 is this idea that we've all been down, and the real test is how we're able to bounce back from those challenging times when we get knocked down. And for me, $7 has become a rallying cry of a time in my life where when I was 23 or 24 years old, that's exactly what I had in my pocket. I was actually 23 years old and I had $7 in my pocket when I was cut from the Canadian Football League and forced to move back in with my parents in Tampa, Florida. So we have the spirit of overcoming challenges and odds are laced throughout the Young Rock series, but not only my own. It's my family. It's my grandmother, my grandfather, it's my dad, my mom, and a lot of people who have I've had the privilege of intersecting with throughout my life, including the wildly crazy and unpredictable world of professional wrestling at a time when pro wrestling wasn't as globally successful as it is today. My parents had a big influence on my growing up and on my life, and they still do. As I sit and do this interview, it is November 2020, and I lost my dad January earlier this year. So my dad, he checked out just like that, and I never had a chance to say goodbye to him. And that's the kind of stuff that sometimes we have to reconcile with in life. My mom has been a strong influence on me too as well. Growing up my entire life, we've always had a very close relationship. So they are featured prominently in Young Rock as I was a little boy. And my mom and I following my dad around the world as he wrestled. So, the relationship I have with my parents was a tight one because I was an only child, and we always kept very close. But it was also a unique one that had a unique perspective with my mom, and also had a very unique, challenging perspective with my dad, who came from an era and a time of a black man who really believed in strong discipline and tough love. And that's how I was raised. And we see that, and we examine that in Young Rock. Well, I grew up in the world of pro wrestling. My dad was a professional wrestler. My grandfather was a professional wrestler. My grandmother was the first female wrestling promoter. And then since then, my cousins, my uncles come from a very long line and lineage of professional wrestlers. My dad had a very successful career in the world of professional wrestling. He came up in the world of professional wrestling in the 60s and in the 70s, and his career peaked in the 80s. But in the 60s and the 70s, when he came over and he started wrestling, he originally started wrestling in Canada. Then he went on into the Detroit territory at that time, and everywhere he went, racial tension was very high. So, he wasn't in investment banking at that time. He was in the world of professional wrestling, where there was a really hardcore, seedy underbelly to that world. And he had to fight his way and circumvent a lot of racial landmines, but also fight through that shit and really become successful in every territory he went to. Territory meaning the promotion. At that time in wrestling, there were local promotions, and it wasn't one big conglomerate as it is today with the WWE. Living on the road with my dad, I lived in 13 or 14 states my dad and my mom and myself, but by the time I was 13 years old, also lived in New Zealand and traveled really extensively. So I was never in one place for too long. Maybe we stayed there for a year and a half maybe, and then we hit the road again and we traveled on down the road to the next place where we would live for about a year or so. So the exposure, I think, was great, and it exposed me to different ways of life, different perspectives. The challenge was there wasn't a real fundamental consistency in terms of home life and always being on the road. So, and especially in that world of professional wrestling. Pro wrestling at that time, when I was growing up as a little boy in the 70s and the 80s, was much different than it is today. And you learn lessons very, very quickly, sometimes hard and harsh, but ultimately really invaluable lessons. So, these are all the things that we explore in Young Rock. And, what we have found so far with creatively from the NBC network to our show creator, Nahnatchka, Jeff Chiang, everybody involved have really found these stories to be really quite unbelievable and astounding at times that I'm even sitting here. So I've had this life that I like to say is a very Forrest Gumpian life, because I've intersected with so many just wild and unpredictable times and moments and individuals in the world of pro wrestling. So the exposure was great growing up with my dad, but also growing up with my dad, again, he was all about tough love.